What up, AP Euro? So here we go. The last notes of the year. Hooray! All right, so let's dive into this. Atrocities, nationalism. Wow, what a bleak topic to end the year with. Thanks, College Board. All right, so anyway, we get to pick up with. Oh, it just gets worse. So we're talking about genocide. Okay, so in World War I, remember the Ottoman Empire was withering and dying, collapsing as an empire, and it had been this large multi-ethnic empire where they had been largely religiously tolerant, which meant you had Jews, Christians, Orthodox, and Muslims all together. But as the empire implodes, we have this Armenian genocide. Armenians were Christians to the north, and during World War I, they were blamed for potentially aiding the enemies of the empire. And so many of them were literally marched or worked to death. All right, 1.5 million is the estimation. The other thing that was always kind of a slippery or tough topic is like people didn't want to recognize that it was a genocide because Turkey always was like mad about it. And so it wasn't until actually President Biden was willing to call it a genocide, which, Turkey was not really in love with, but the rest of the world was like, oh, interesting. Somebody's willing to say what it was. Second World War, another genocide, and that would be the Holocaust. And the genocide, I mean, there's actually multiple, but ethnically they were targeting Jews and Slavic peoples, the Poles, right? Hitler gave a famous speech that Poland must be depopulated and repopulated with Germans. Kind of gives a warning there. But it wasn't just an ethnic hatred for the Holocaust or a religious hatred with the Holocaust. It was this dangerous quasi-science that had been brewing for, a long time across Europe. Remember, we talked about the dangers of social Darwinism and the dangers of, science being used to kind of justify some pretty sketchy stuff. And so we got to this concept of eugenics and phrenology and some of these studies of like, we can tell if you're going to be intelligent by measuring the size of your skull, or if your parents were criminals, you're probably going to be a criminal. And so let's neuter all of the people in insane asylums or prisons. I mean, dangerous ideas. And it wasn't just Germany, to be fair. I mean, other countries did this, like America, sadly. We sterilized inmates for a while as well in the 1930s, in a dark moment in our history. So I just threw in a couple of little images here to kind of get to that concept, though. Right. Here's this German guy with this folklore of the old Norse mythology, tapping into this, like not even necessarily science. It's this hybrid of romantic ideologies and mythology, but then also this dangerous science of like, biology and breeding. And so it's gross. Right. And so 11 million people died during the Greater Holocaust. 6.5 million were Jews, but then not to mention all of the Roma or Gypsies, Slavs, communists, the disabled, handicapped, criminals. I went to Dachau years ago and got to see where they held just the political prisoners. It started as a place for communists and radical leftists that were anti-government. Okay. There were more genocides later on in the 20th century, going into the 1990s. All right, so as Yugoslavia fell apart at the end of the Cold War, right, there was this great conflict in Bosnia and Serbia. And so it took a communist strongman, someone like Marshal Tito, to keep that many multiple ethnicities together. And so when he was gone, it all starts to implode. And so Serbians, Orthodox Christians, made up the ethnic majority in places like Serbia and Bosnia. But in order to try to impose their will in the area or convince it that it was supposed to be theirs, they commit these horrible atrocities. Right? We have allegations. I mean, I wasn't there, right? But the allegations is literally whole towns being taken out into the forest and mowed down by a machine gun. You had Serbian soldiers not wearing military attire, so that wouldn't be considered war crimes necessarily. It would just be considered murdered by, unofficered men, or ununiformed men. Really sad stuff. And most of those atrocities were committed against Bosnians and Albanians, ethnically Bosnian or Albanian, people who were practicing the Muslim religion. One last thing, and although maybe not necessarily under the category of genocide, it certainly fits in atrocities and definitely fits in nationalism. The Serbs were nationalistic, right? I mean, they were looking for an expanded greater Serbia. They didn't believe that Bosnia should be under the control of ethnic minority groups. They thought it should be under ethnic majority groups like the Serbs. Well, we also have violence in the name of nationalism in Northern Ireland, right? A prime example, the Irish wanted a nation. They wanted a free, liberated Northern Ireland. And so through the 60s and 70s, right, you had the Battle of the Bogside, these horrible protest marches that turned into murder in the streets. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, fought for freedom, and they fought against the Ulster Union or the Unionists, who are the Protestants who wanted to remain in connection with Great Britain. By the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, there was enough global pressure to try to generate some peace in the area, and largely Irish peace has held. Sadly, right now in this post-Brexit kind of world, there is a fear that a lot of that violence may come back. There's already been little hints of more violence just in the last year here. And then I think under a nationalist approach, I just added this. Sadly, I think whether we believe it or not, or how you want to package it, right? 3 million Ukrainians did actually ethnically identify themselves as Russian, not Ukrainian, speaking Russian as a language. And so Russia has tried to tap onto that, the concept that like maybe the Donbass, that area in the eastern part of Ukraine, should separate. So here you go, the Greater Russian Empire going into World War I, and you'll notice, right, if we look at it, there's Kyiv and Lublin, right? So that all the way into Poland, this is Ukraine, Moldova, all were part of the Russian Empire. And so Putin's idea is to kind of in a Nicholas II, last czar of the empire kind of way, reestablish that imperial hold in Eastern Europe. All right, now other topics that we need to cover real quick. Migrations of people is one. Big migrations really happened at the end of the Cold War. Right, so as the Berlin Wall came down and we had reunification of East and West Germany, Germans flooded from east into west to try to get a taste of freedom. In the even more modern time, right, in just the last 5-10 years here, the massive amount of revolutions, terrorism, warfare, famine in Africa has been one of the major generators of migration north out of Africa. And I put this picture here. Right, we can see how many people really from like places like Tunisia and Algeria hopping on these super unsafe, overcrowded boats and trying to illegally immigrate into Europe. Really common destination places are areas like Sardinia, Sicily, those areas in southern Italy. And so in some of those places, overrun really by migrants, I mean, huge amounts, which created a backlash. I mean, there really was a huge issue of do the European Union states accept these migrants and try to spread them out, which was ultimately answer, or do we shut the borders? And so there was a quota system created. Angela Merkel actually was one of the big people involved in creating these migrant quotas. And so places like Sweden, right, France, took heavy quotas of migrants coming into the continent to try to spread them around. Syrian refugees after 2010 with the Syrian crisis. And so actually just recently, all right, France has had their second round of national voting, right? So this is Marie Le Pen. She is an ultra-conservative. She has ran against Emmanuel Macron for the last 2 elections here. Macron has become the first French president to win a re-election in back-to-back terms for like the last 30 years now. But Marie Le Pen, his conservative opponent, really has made one of the centers of her platform anti-immigration, right? That France is swamped with East Africans and North Africans and that they should take no more. Also, she is now kind of siding on the idea that, like, let's stop propping up the Ukraine. They don't deserve any more money. All right, so our last real big topic then is kind of like multifaceted, but we're looking in the EU and what it's done for culture. All right, so to not bog down too much, but to at least kind of set it up, the EU is not like some instant phenomenon of the 1990s. Right? This was a long time coming in Europe. And remember in class, I've talked about several times now this idea of a European community. So whether it was the humanist movement of the Renaissance, whether you could say that the Enlightenment and science had created a community of learning, certainly we would say that there was a community feel in the Congress of Vienna and this conservative desire to create a harmonious new order across Europe. We definitely have a sense of a growing community again. So by 1947, what they called the GATT Agreement set up that 23 nations would all agree to be in this general trade and tariff thing. And so, really, the origin point of the EU, or these European community in general, was to try to create a close to free trade zone, right? Economic partners. It is not accidental that that is 1947, right? So think about it. Contextually, World War II is over. The economies have been crushed. Lots of rebuilding will be needed. Debt has been piled up from the war. And so these are Western nations helping Western nations. These would be similar countries that would be receiving money through like the Marshall Plan. These would be oftentimes nations that would be interested in UN membership, maybe NATO states, right? So you have kind of a Western pro-democratic, pro-capitalist vibe to this. By the late 60s, right, we start to see the European community actually growing in name, so the economic European community. But this is really the prototype to our modern EU, right? So we're talking about then headquarters in Brussels with a parliament, nations actually sending representatives to go and vote on their behalf. This was then repackaged under the Maastricht Agreements, or the Treaty of Maastricht, in 1991, and was formally ratified and accepted by 1992. That created the EU, or the European Union. Their slogan, right, their core guiding mission statement was one currency, one culture, one social area, one environment. So again, one uniqueness, this idea that we're all unified or in a centralized state. And so a couple of the key goals of this EU was to have one EU passport, one common border for EU states, right? So to travel into France and then into Belgium was not actually separated by another border check or security. Entering in one state, then all other states accepted that entrance under that passport. Freedom of movement has been and will continue to be not only the most important political side of the EU, but it's also very divisive. A major reason for the Brexit concerns of England in 2016 was the freedom of movement, right? Their belief was with immigration quotas, right, as African and Syrian refugees started to pour into Europe. Their fear was that they would live in Italy for like 2 years, gain EU membership, and then they could travel wherever the heck they wanted. And so England would be overrun. There's also, let's be honest, a quasi-racism to this, not just against Black Africa, but also against like Slavic peoples or Eastern Europeans, right? So one of the great stereotypes in Britain was that with freedom to movement, people from weak economies, underdeveloped nations like Poland, would then travel west and take the better paying jobs in Britain's economy. And so they had to Brexit out. All right. And so that kind of gives us an idea. By 2002, the common currency was established. People were on the euro. Some nations that were members of the EU did retain their own currency. So, for example, Britain never really hopped on the euro anyway. And so, as I mentioned before, Brexit took place in 2016 was the vote. It took them a while. 5 years later, it was actually put into effect. What's interesting is now I kind of feel like England is walking back from that a little bit. In the shadow of this Ukraine conflict, I think European community is actually being tested right now. This is a litmus test for whether or not there is community in Europe. The EU has responded. NATO has responded. There seems to be this outpouring of support. But will it last? And what's interesting is England, for all of its bluster to get out of the EU, because they didn't want to be dragged into other people's economic problems, like bailing out Greece every time it goes into a financial meltdown. Well, here's England getting involved in other people's problems like they said they didn't want, right? They don't need to be involved in the Ukraine. They don't need to be giving money, but there's this sense of community. I still think that holds the Western democratic, let's be honest, people contextually who are in NATO and fought in the war together to still kind of hold together in this concept of a European community. All right, the last couple of things then is the culture that comes out of this. All right, so cultural response to this growing sense of community. One of the biggest things that we would have to say that democracy and a growing sense of community has led to is, again, a greater sense of feminism across Europe, certainly in Central and Western Europe, even to the highest degrees. So, for example, the book The Second Sex came out in the early 70s, and it basically kind of gave this idea that women had been always isolated. And it wasn't like a race or an ethnicity thing, that literally half of humanity, just based on the chromosomes in their body, had been unfairly treated. And Simone de Beauvoir basically was making the argument that women had also kind of done it to themselves because they hadn't organized. They hadn't fought harder for themselves. And so they were, in essence, like doomed to their own laziness and had taken the high road. And the high road, morality, wasn't going to pay off. And so women needed to be somewhat more like men and live a free, open lifestyle. Although they would be judged on double standard, they shouldn't be worried about it. Proof of the impact of this would then be the creation of NOW, the National Organization of Women, who across not just Europe, but then into America and other Western Hemisphere states fought for legal rights, protections, ending the glass ceiling, reproductive rights, education for women, all of those kind of things. And so we really notice that the impact of these has really been just that. Women in the workforce getting better pay, though still not equal. Access to birth control, although very aggressively debated in Western nations. Access to abortion, sexual freedom, right? Women having the ability to be out of relationships, be sexually active. Two examples of very powerful women of the time: Mary Robinson, and then, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who was, interestingly, an ultra conservative prime minister in Britain during the late 70s going into the 80s. Okay, and then finally, to bring it all home culturally, we mentioned during World War I and going into World War II, surrealism, people like Salvador Dali up here in the top. That will eventually evolve into abstract expressionism, which is pictured here. So artists like Jackson Pollock, for example. Actually, Milwaukee had several nice, really cool examples of Jackson Pollock. Roy Lichtenstein was just here, but right before COVID hit. Really neat exhibits. And that brings us to pop art, which isn't quite postmodern, but brings us right there, the Andy Warhols, right? The famous Campbell soup and the Marilyn Monroe art. And what it's kind of interesting is that it acknowledges that there is a pop culture, and it doesn't want to destroy or diminish the power of collective culture, but it also wants to kind of like, want to take a critical look at maybe the mindless mundane that comes with our consumer culture as a repercussion of our interconnectivity and our community economics. So there you go. And that brings us up to the modern age. Hopefully this helps. All right, good luck, guys.